Hi everyone, I hope you've had a nice holiday so far. We're just going to dive straight into area study 2, which is adaptations for survival. This is the first in 3 lectures that will be for chapter 5. So this first one will be the introduction, the next one will be all about survival of certain animals, and then the last one, a little bit shorter, will be survival of certain plants. So let's get straight into adapting for survival. So you may have heard of something called the rule of threes. It means that we can have 3 minutes without water, 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter, and 3 weeks without food. So when you are in a survival situation, the first thing that you want to be looking for after, of course, air to breathe, which you hopefully have found, is water. Next is shelter, and next is food. So that really speaks to the importance of having certain adaptations that equip us to maintain our equilibrium in terms of oxygen and that sort of thing. Shelter is very, very important to find because one of the easiest ways to die out in the wilderness is due to exposure, so there's extreme temperature conditions. This is based on something called a tolerance range. So all creatures have a tolerance range that they can survive or thrive in. This picture here shows the optimum range that these fish can live in. Anything outside of that is survivable, but it does put them under physiological stress. My face is hiding the high end. So these fish can survive within a set temperature limit very well. Beyond that, it's a little bit difficult, and beyond that, that means that they cannot survive. Tolerance range there. It is the particular environmental conditions in which a species can live and reproduce. That is the tolerance range. Can live and reproduce. We have some tolerance factors that decide on a tolerance range. So tolerance factors are things like temperature, things like desiccation. That's another word for drying out. If you've ever seen those little sachets you put sometimes in chip packets, they're called desiccants. They take out the moisture so the chips stay crunchy. Things like oxygen or dissolved oxygen either in the air or in the water. For instance, some species cannot live at very high altitudes because there's not enough dissolved oxygen. Some species cannot live in very deep, deep ocean because there's just not enough dissolved oxygen. And the last one here would be exposure to sunlight and also UV. So temperature, desiccation, oxygen, dissolved oxygen, sunlight, and ultraviolet exposure. So obviously some plants and some animals thrive with high sunlight exposure, some not. These are 4 or 5 main tolerance factors that decide on a species given tolerance range. So let's say if an animal is pushed outside of its tolerance range, either because of a change in season, or there's been a change to its environment, or it's moved. There are 2 possible things that an organism can do to respond to a change to get out of the tolerance range, and that is to either compensate or escape. Escape being to physically remove itself from the situation. To compensate has to do with adaptations. Very important. Improvise, adapt, overcome. That is what we do in the wild. Okay, so say an animal is pushed, or any organism really, is pushed out of its tolerance range. Its options are either to escape. An example of this would be something like migration. So as the seasons change, you often see birds and larger pack animals migrating either south or north for the winter or summer to escape a certain temperature. You might also see something like burrowing, so species going underground to escape the heat or to stay warm when it's cold. So that's escape. The other way that organisms can escape, can stay within their tolerance range, is having certain adaptations that respond to the temperature, light, oxygen, heat, that sort of thing. These adaptations can be structural, so that is the actual physical layout of their body, the size of them, the shape of them, how many of something they have, that sort of thing, things that you can actually observe. Behavioral, so things that that organism does, whether that is huddling together or whether that is, hunting as a pack, those sorts of things. And the last one is physiological. So that has to do with internal mechanisms. That could be a hormonal balance. That could be a process that absorbs water. That could be some sort of internal physical structure. So structural, behavioral, and physiological. An example, let's think of something like a polar bear. An example of a structural adaptation would be its white fur that helps it blend into the environment. Something that's behavioral would be that it stalks its prey and covers its nose when it's hunting. Something that's physiological would be its propensity to store fat to help it stay warm. A limiting factor is any condition that approaches or exceeds the limits of tolerance for an organism, and that varies depending on habitat. Let's look at some examples. So if we look at this particular example, this is the forest floor. The limiting factor for something like this will be light intensity. So the plants or creatures that exist on the forest floor have less light available to them than the ones in the upper canopy. That's a limiting factor to their survival. That limits how they can thrive, that limits how far they can grow, that limits their ability to reproduce. Desert, a limiting factor would be water availability. Only certain creatures can survive in that environment. Not every single creature can. Some have the necessary adaptations or behavioral mechanisms to deal with a low water environment. Let's look at a littoral or coastal zone. So that is shallow water. The factor here would be desiccation. So desiccation being drying out. Remember those chip sachets? Because look, if you're a marine creature, that is a water-dwelling creature in here, you still have a huge exposure to sunlight and UV. So that means that there may be you're more likely to dry out. So there's got to be certain factors that you do, certain behaviors that you do to avoid desiccation, to make sure that you stay moist as a marine creature. Polar region, of course, the limiting factor is temperature. Not every creature can survive in these extreme cold environments. Let's look at one more. A habitat like a stagnant pond. As you can see, stagnant meaning it doesn't move, it stays still, and it's covered in this algae. So there's not really much turbid action of the water, I should say. So there's not much water being moved around. Just like when you have an aquarium and you have those bubblers, that's to get oxygen moving around the water. So that means within this watery environment, there is very little dissolved oxygen. So there's only certain creatures that can actually survive. There's a limit to what creatures can survive in these particular habits because of the limiting factors. There's a limit to what kind of creatures, and there's a limit to how they can reproduce. Now let's think of a habitat that we may be a little bit more familiar with, and that is that of our very dry continent. Of all the 7 continents, of all the 7 inhabited ones, Australia has the least total rainfall of all. About almost 3/4 of our continent is arid, meaning dry, A-R-I-D, dry. And that means, but however, there's still many creatures that survive there. The desiccation, the dryingness, the high sunlight, the high UV, they're all limiting factors to what creatures can survive. And it also means that they have to have certain behavioral adaptations to reproduce. Our native creatures have an amazing range of adaptations, which we'll be looking at in the next video. That's just a little summary of what I just said. Okay, let's move on to water balance. Water is life, remember. Water is, we are the blue planet. Water is the key to all of life. We ourselves are between 70-80% water, and most creatures on Earth are between 70 to 80% water, and most plants are at least 80% water. Water is life. It is the stuff that everything dissolves in. It's really what makes us able to move, makes us able to communicate. It's very important. And so we have something called the water balance. Basically, it means water in is equivalent to water out. That is to say, if I added up the water that I took in minus the water that I excreted, it would equal 0. Because of course, if you take in more than you let out, you're going to explode. You're going to be too big. If you get rid of too much, then of course you're going to be desiccated. You're going to be shrunk. Water is an amazing molecule. One of the most amazing things about it is that it has this cohesive property. So overall, it's a neutral molecule. However, oxygen is a slightly negative atom, and hydrogens are slightly positive. So that's what we see here: the slightly positive, slightly negative, and that means that they attract to each other via these strong hydrogen bonds. The slightly positive ends of hydrogen and the slightly positive ends of oxygen means that one single molecule of oxygen can then stick to others. One molecule of water can stick to 4 other molecules of water via cohesion, which we learned about via capillary action last chapter. A second amazing feature about water is that it's an incredible solvent. It's really known as the universal solvent. What we're looking at here is a molecule of sodium chloride. See sodium chloride. At the top here, it's being dropped into the water molecule, into the container. And then what we're seeing here is the negatively charged chlorines attaching to the positively charged hydrogens. And then alternately, you can see the slightly positive sodium bonding with the slightly negative oxygen. And that is how water dissolves things. Its positive bit bonds with the negative bit of something, its negative bit bonds with the positive bit of something else. And that's how we get potassium and iodine and all of our necessary nutrients and molecules through this process of water being a solvent and bonding. Water is very resistant to temperature change. It's stable. If you live in a coastal region, you'll experience much less dramatic changes in temperature than if you lived in the inner city or inner suburbs, because you're living near a body of water. It resists temperature change. It has a high heat of vaporization, so water needs to get to quite a high temperature before it evaporates, basically, unlike something like petrol, which evaporates at a much lower temperature. It also has a really high heat of fusion, so it needs to get up to a higher temperature before it actually freezes together. And once it does, it's quite stable. The lucky last thing that's very cool about water is that it's less dense as a solid than as a liquid. Now, you can imagine if it was more dense as a solid, and you had water freezing from the bottom up of a lake, that would mean that the little fish at the bottom wouldn't be able to get the nutrients from the dirt. They'd be trapped there, and also they'd be more exposed to the cold environment that's making the water freeze in the first place. So water being less dense as a solid is another incredible feature of water. Obviously, we are mostly water, but where is our water actually? So this is a little graph that shows you that about 2/3 of our water is within cells, intracellular fluid. Almost a quarter, just over a quarter, is interstitial. So that means between the cells and the blood vessels. And then we've got a little bit in our plasma. So our plasma is the watery liquid stuff that makes up the blood, that our blood cells actually float around in. Women have a little bit less, biological women have a little bit less water than males, and that's simply because they have a little bit more fat. They've got a little bit more fat because they have more internal organs that need protection internally. Many of our tissues are mostly water, as we are mostly water. As you can see here, the kidneys being a water processing, like a urine processing organ, are very high in water. Something like fat, not very high at all. This is an overall water balance diagram. It's a pretty good one to pause and have a look at. What I want you to take away from this is that we have water gain being equivalent to water loss. Our water gain comes from 2 things: external, so food and drink, so eating and drinking, remembering that most of the food that we eat is actually made up of water, unless we're just eating like dry saladas all day, but probably not. And then we also have a little bit of water produced from metabolism, and that is cellular respiration, remembering that one of the products of cellular respiration is water. So some of that water we do breathe out, but some of it's also produced by the cells, so it's kept in the system. Water loss can be from a few different ways. through waste, so through urine and feces. So that'd be the kidney, so the kidney processing the urine, and the gut processing feces, the gut being the intestines, the stomach, that sort of thing. Lungs, so we do breathe out water vapor when we breathe, and also the skin. You produce a lot of water through your skin, even if you're not sweating. It's called insensible water loss because you can't actually notice it. Sweating, we don't really notice sweating. So for our purposes, we're not really going to be thinking about sweating as a form of water loss because it only occurs under high temperature pressure. So that's high temperature due to external factors or high temperature due to your body's metabolism via exercise. Insensible means you don't actually feel the water you lose from your skin very much at all. Another way that we produce water is the mammalian gland, so producing milk for our young. That's a good one to pause and have a look at. Take a look at that, and then I'm just going to leave that here, and then I will see you for the next lecture.